Let's talk about firmware rootkits. Well, first of all, what is firmware? Well, firmware is a small amount of code that runs on many types of devices, including computers, laptops, servers, firewalls, routers, switches, hard drives, embedded systems, as well as consumer electronics, IoT devices, your television, my television, and soon to be your light bulbs and my light bulbs, and pretty much anything with any type of electronic intelligence has firmware. Here you can see a chip example of what it might look like on some devices. It is often held in non-volatile memory devices such as ROMs, EPROMs, or flash memory. It is tiny and generally not modified, often like you do with user land or kernel land software. If an attacker, a threat, is able to place malware, or you can call it a firmware rootkit, within the firmware, this is extremely problematic. Firmware often has full access over the system in most cases. So therefore, if the rootkit is on there, the attacker also can have full access as well. And as I said, firmware is everywhere, from your BIOS on the motherboard of your laptop or your device, through to the firmware that's on your hard drive or your USB devices. They all have firmware. This shouldn't be too unfamiliar to you. This is Irate Monk. On the hard drives, we have seen the NSA's Irate Monk, which infiltrates the firmware of hard drives, manufactured in this case, in this particular attack, by Maxtron, Samsung, Seagate, and Western Digital. And this rootkit firmware, this will survive reinstalls of the operating system and reformatting of the hard drive. And I'm sure the likes of the NSA and other world intelligence agencies will only have increased capabilities in this area in terms of hard drive firmware rootkit since this leak happened. How many hard drives do they, as standard, have firmware rootkit installed on them? Have they managed to get into the supply chain of hard drive manufacturers? And we have firmware rootkit on lots of different hardware and hard drives. Who knows? Kaspersky discovered that the Equation Group has developed hard drive firmware modifications for various drive models. The malware allows data to be stored on the drive in locations that will not be erased, even if the drive is formatted or wiped. And over 500 infections were discovered at the time in at least 42 countries, and evidence suggested this was developed for one of the three-letter agencies. JetPlow, again from the NSA, as more examples. Firmware that was implanted to create a permanent backdoor in Cisco PIC series and ASA firewalls. Another firmware rootkit, and again, I'm sure their capabilities are only increasing, and all of the nation states that have this cyber attack and defense strategies will have similar capabilities as well. And of course, firmware rootkits are no longer just for nation states. The hacking team was developing a UEFI rootkit written for the INCID BIOS, a very common BIOS in laptops. This has or had remote control capabilities and is able to maintain persistence even if the hard drive is formatted, the operating system reinstalled, replaced, and the hard drive replaced, because obviously this is running on the motherboard. On the plus side, firmware malware will probably be harder to install remotely because it will be requiring vulnerabilities to exploit, although some devices do provide out-of-band access to hardware, which could help in adversaries installing firmware remotely. With physical access, it's much easier to install a rootkit into the firmware. Physical access makes changing firmware much easier and could be quickly achieved by placing bad USB in a device. There has been a hacker presentation on hacking the extensible firmware interface, which you can see here. And this here is a summary of the attacks against the BIOS and the secure boot and related chipsec modules at DEF CON 22. So you can give that a watch if you want to dig deeper into how the BIOS can be attacked from Intel Security. Firmware malware or rootkits are a real problem in my view, with little in the way of good solutions right now. Firmware is an excellent target for all adversaries, not just nation states. hackers will be targeting firmware. Hackers are targeting firmware. One of the biggest threats comes from proprietary, closed-source firmware developed by manufacturers who have little concern for security or even skill in security architecture. Think about all of the devices that you have or will have going forward that have unknown firmware code running on them. Your router, your motherboard, your hard drive, your tablet, TV, washing machine, mobile phone. Recently, here, 3 million Androids with rootkits, your printer, your set-top box, and all the other IoT devices that you're going to buy. These will be riddled with security flaws, and manufacturers will be in little rush to patch them unless there's some sort of legislation. And then we may be getting big government along with that in order to solve the problem, which then creates additional problems in terms of the government wanting to control what can and cannot happen. And usually when governments try to take control, it isn't good for the freedom of the internet. And let's assume these manufacturers do care about these devices. How will they patch them? Will they all need to be on the internet, making them open to attack? Will they be auto-updated? Will the auto-update process be secure, or will that just be another mechanism to attack you? It's a problem. Open source hardware is an attempt to mitigate some of these issues, but it's very difficult to have an entirely open source system. And not only do we have manufacturers that will create poor products, we have the products being attacked as well anyway. Here we have James Clapper, the US Director of National Intelligence, saying, in the future, intelligence services might use the Internet of Things for identification, surveillance, monitoring, location tracking, and targeting for recruitment or to gain access to networks or user credentials. And of course, you can bet they will. And every other organization and hacker will be doing exactly the same, because there will be many devices, many IoT devices that will have very poor firmware, and that firmware will be targeted for all of those things he just described: surveillance, monitoring, location tracking, etc. In the section on network separation, we discussed isolating networks for trusted and untrusted devices. This will become more important the more devices you have with unknown firmware. If we consider the firmware on the motherboard, we have the UEFI and the BIOS. There are some protection mitigation methods we can consider. You would want to enable secure boot if you have it and if it's compatible with what you're running. It's not perfect, but it is a layer of protection. You should make sure that UEFI secure flash is enabled. You should update the BIOS or the UEFI whenever there is a security patch. You should set a BIOS or UEFI password, and you should reflash your firmware if you suspect any problems, if that is indeed possible. But of course, reflashing firmware is always a little bit risky. If it goes wrong, your system can be inaccessible, but if it's the right firmware, it should be okay. But you can never guarantee it with some of these poor manufacturers.